So are free markets being framed? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. That's a good way of putting it. It's the kind of thing where they say, here's our government, we're going to throw a bunch of money at this problem, and then they step back and they look at it and they say, wow, that didn't work. We definitely didn't throw enough money at that problem. And so now they throw $1 billion at the problem, then they step back and they say, now it's really messed up. We definitely should have thrown $1 trillion at that problem. So now we've got our current president and Congress throwing trillions of dollars because throwing billions of dollars didn't solve the problem. And you take Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, for example, that were 50% free market at best. At best, they were probably far more regulated than that. And people say, look, they've collapsed. It's the free market that caused this. When in a free market society, government companies like that never would have existed. It would be something that was run literally by a free market competition. One company outgrows another or swallows up another. One that isn't doing its job completely runs itself out of business. But in the case of these two monetary giants, we looked at it and we said, wow, they really messed up. 50% control wasn't enough, so now the government stepped in and taken total control of these two giants and said, well, that should fix it, because 50% didn't do it because free market still had enough control to cause problems. So it's, if you look at America back in the time when we were allowed a truly free market, from the inception of our nation up until the turn of into the 1900s, we became in a very short time the most powerful economic nation in the world. I mean, we went from just these scrappling soldiers with guns strapped over their backs to a powerhouse in a century, which is just amazing. And then for the last 100 years now, we've slowly whittled away at that, and now we wonder why we're in the mess we're at. And we blame it on the free market, which we haven't had for over 100 years.
Hobbes tells us that human beings are, I'm inaccurately quoting him, but nasty, brutish, and short, and that they look out for their own self-interest, and that only. And some people would say, well, leading up to the 1900s, monopolies resulted, and there was a lot of poverty. Distribution of wealth was, well, it was very concentrated into one small pocket of insanely rich people, and then there was a large part of the country that didn't have much. There was a gap between rich and poor that was chasmatic, you could say. And then they would say that it wasn't until we started regulating, we had antitrust laws, we busted up the monopolies. It wasn't until we started doing that the middle class started to be empowered and our nation stabilized. How do you respond to them?
The funny thing on that is that the monopolies that we talk of were government monopolies. These railroads were receiving subsidies and government handouts even back then that created the monopolies in the first place. You have to look philosophically at how that happens to understand what's literally gone on. A monopoly in a true market or in a state of nature cannot exist. And the reason for that being, as soon as one person or group of people, a company, gets so big that they start charging too much for their service, there will always be somebody else who will spring up and charge less money for the same good or service. As long as there isn't a government power, somebody with guns, which is what the definition of government is, somebody with guns pointing at that little guy saying, you can't spring up because he's the only one allowed to sell widgets. And so the one big widget guy remains big because the government points the guns at everyone else and says, you can't sell them, only he can. But without the guns pointed, there will always be somebody else spring up who will sell the widgets and sell them for a lesser price. Unless he keeps his prices habitually low and his service constantly high, which very rarely happens, which is why competition is such a great thing. As soon as his service goes down, or his quality goes down, or his price goes up too much, widget number 2 opens up and they compete for business. And if those 2 aren't doing enough, then widget number 3, 4, 5, until there's 1,000 widget companies making widgets and competing on a level playing field. At some point, some of these guys are going to falter, their service starts to stink, people stop buying their widgets, and they're gone. Because you've got to stay sharp. You've got to impress the customer. And ultimately, in a true free market, it is the only place where customers, which in this case meaning we the people, have all of the power. Because there are no guns pointing at anybody. My power is in my vote with that dollar bill. I will buy his widget because it's the lowest price and the best service, or because it's the right color, or whatever it is for me. So my vote in dollar bills goes to widget company 10, and if the majority of the constituents agree, their money will go to him, and he's going to be the most successful widget company. As soon as he starts getting greedy and cutting the quality, they ditch and go to widget company number 2. So seeing that philosophy, you can go back and see exactly how that's happened in every case in America's history where there's been a monopoly. Well, it's been a government-protected monopoly, meaning they've either made regulations so difficult for new guys to spring up that they couldn't do so, or they've given so much money and subsidies to the big guy that's already there that it was impossible for the little guys to compete, because the guys with guns were taking money through taxes from all of us, giving it to the big guy, and making it impossible for anyone else to keep up with his income, because we were being forced at gunpoint to give our money to that through taxes to that company.
If you were in charge right now, how realistic do you believe it to be for you to be able to implement a lot of these ideals? Do you think it could happen these days?
You mean like the sole dictator of the country?
Well, if you were able to persuade enough politicos to think your way, how would you stop the people from storming the palace when you eliminate their social programs?
Right, and that's a good question. That's something libertarian think tanks have gone over a lot, and conservative think tanks as well, have gone over the idea of how do we do this? We're so addicted to entitlements, how do we do this? I think it can't happen snap of the finger and it's done. I really do think people would storm the palace. So I think it would have to be through a phase-out process. But I don't think it would take as long as we might think. It wouldn't take 100 years. It wouldn't even take 50 years. I think in one generation, we could make that entire shift. If of course, we persuaded 51% of the people to vote that way starting today, we could have that shift within 10 years.
Any future political aspirations that you have?
None. I was joking with my dad the other day. I said, you know, rather than be a politician, I'd rather raise enough money and own a few of them. That's a joke, but I think that there are better ways to persuade the populace than to become a politician. And I would rather talk to people, and actually coming up with money and being able to start PACs where you can advertise and get word out on certain issues. There's some groups have done a great job, both on the right, the left, and in between, on doing that and putting out their word and convincing hordes of people to follow that particular ideal. I'd much rather do that than to become a politician. I feel like for me, becoming a politician at this point, I would have to sacrifice too much of what I know to be true to do that.
Mr. Jed Stout, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. This has been Southern Utah Interview, and have a good day.